Good morning, Deputy Prime Minister.
Good morning, Trevor.
What can you tell us this morning about the state of the Russian advance, particularly on the key cities of Kiev, Odessa and Mariupol?
Well, of course, Putin came in and had sold to the Russian people, but also to his conscripts on the ground in Ukraine, that this would be far easier than it's turned out. That is partly a testament to the resilience and the courage of the Ukrainian people. And of course, we've been supporting them with training through Operation Orbital, which has trained over 22,000 Ukrainian armed forces. Also, the anti-tank missiles, 2,000 that we provided them, and the wider international community. But they have definitely proved a tougher prospect than Putin expected, and that has an effect on morale on the Russian side as well. Of course, at the same time, we've imposed the biggest sanctions package I can remember, with devastating consequences in terms of the ruble, fallen to record low, the stock market, and also we've seen the Russian central bank, which itself has been subject to sanctions, doubling interest rates. That has put the squeeze on Putin. What he's now doing is responding with ever more brutal tactics to try and wrest back the initiative. I think the bottom line is none of the major cities have yet fallen, but I think we ought to be under no doubt that our mission with our allies is to ensure Putin fails in Ukraine. That is going to take some time. We're talking about months, if not years, and therefore we'll have to show some strategic stamina, because this is not going to be over in days.
Well, let's unpack some of that and let's deal with some of the immediate issues. The Red Cross says that the Russians have broken the ceasefire by shelling civilians. This is actually your own professional field as a lawyer, and you've prosecuted war criminals. This must be a war crime, mustn't it?
Well, you're right that the reckless and, frankly, appalling tactics by the Putin regime must be held to account, not just Putin himself, but also anyone taking illegal orders. And so on top of the £220 million of humanitarian support we're providing to the Ukrainian people, we're also very clear that as the International Criminal Court opens its examination of what's taking place, and it's right that a court decides whether war crimes have been committed, we will provide the support, diplomatic support. We've been part of the countries that have referred this to the ICC, but also we've got a history from Nuremberg onwards of supporting war crimes prosecutions, whether it's through forensic evidence and or right the way through to, of course, Charles Taylor, Radovan Karadzic are here in British jails, and we'll do whatever it takes. We've got a huge amount of experience. And I would also just say it's part of what we do as a country, as a force for good. You have a British prosecutor at the ICC. There's a British judge, Joe Corner. They're independent, but it is part of what we do to support those institutions and hold Putin to account.
Just to be clear, someone can be prosecuted in absentia. They don't have to be there at the ICC. And it doesn't actually matter that you might say, a commander might say, I was only following orders. Just to be absolutely clear, anybody who takes steps that will be defined as a war crime can be and will be prosecuted, if you have your way, at the ICC. Whether they turn up, they don't turn up, whether they are the Putin himself or they're a captain on the ground.
Well, of course, the ICC is independent. We need to respect the prosecutorial judicial independence. So these are decisions for them to make. What I'm saying is it is absolutely right that there is rigorous, full accountability for anything that happens. And the fact that the ICC is looking at this is something that we don't just support as a, if you like, political measure, because we're a state party to the ICC, but also we will do what it takes with nuts and bolts cooperation to try and help them. And the point, I guess, at this point in time, while the conflict is raging, is to preserve as much evidence as we can.
And they need to know this, is your point?
My point, the here and now in all of this, is I want, and we want, and the ICC is making clear, that for all of those commanders on the ground, right through to the people around Putin in the Kremlin, what they do now, whether they give or whether they follow illegal orders to commit war crimes, they will be held to account for it. And they need to know that. And will it affect morale? It often does in these types of situations.
You and I have spoken before about your own family's flight from the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia. More than 1 million people are fleeing Ukraine. The UN says maybe 1.5 million have crossed borders. What are we doing to help people get out to neighbouring states?
Well, as I said, we've provided over £200 million in humanitarian assistance. We'll work with the international agencies, obviously the UN, and those European countries that are closest to Ukraine. It always happens that people want to go if they have to leave their home country, and that is hugely traumatic. They'll want to go, or they tend to want to go to places which are as close as possible because they'll want to go back as soon as conditions on the ground help. We've also made it clear, both in relation to dependents of Brits here who are Ukrainian or Ukrainians living here, that we will provide the visa flexibility. So we estimate up to 200,000 could come here. And on top of that, there is a humanitarian protection mechanism that the Home Secretary has set up to allow the charitable business or individual sponsorship of those to come here from Ukraine.
I want to come to the visa regime in a moment, but just sticking with what is happening on the borders there. We've seen in recent times the flow of civilians from conflicts being used, essentially weaponised, to destabilise other states. Belarus did that, and so on. Are you concerned that Putin will use this flow to destabilise Poland, Moldova, Romania, or, frankly, as human shields for his own troops?
I think anything is possible. When you look at what Putin has done in the past, in all the wars he's been involved in, you look at the tactics in Syria, I don't think that there is any tactic he wouldn't resort to. But I would say this, I think NATO and Central and Eastern European countries are absolutely resolute, and we will support them to the hilt in not allowing that to be the case. I think the impact Putin will have on NATO, on the resilience and the resolve of Central and Eastern European countries will be the opposite of what he wishes. I think it will only steel their nerve, and we will support them all the way.
All right, let's talk about some, if I can put it this way, more difficult questions. President Zelensky has called for a no-fly zone to be established by NATO. NATO, and in particularly our government, you have responded by saying that such a step would be provoke a Europe-wide conflict. Surely the humanitarian crisis playing out before our eyes is going to change the calculus over that.
Well, I think the humanitarian situation is something we're going to constantly need to innovate and evolve in our response to, and ultimately try and stem and prevent. But the reality is that it's not just the UK, it's all of the NATO allies. The US has been the same, European partners have been the same. We're not going to either get ourselves into a direct military conflict with Putin, either because that would be a massive escalation, but also that feeds Putin's narrative. Putin wants to say that he's actually in a struggle with the West. He's not. This is an illegal invasion of a neighbour whose self-determination, democratic and territorial integrity needs to be protected. We do not want to feed Putin's narrative.
Yeah, but you've just spent quite a lot of time telling me how much money, how much effort we're putting in to protecting people. The truth of the matter is we already know that he's not that bothered about damage done to civilians, and that the humanitarian corridors could be vulnerable. The American diplomat Kurt Volker, from whom we'll be hearing later in this programme, said to me this week that when the bodies start piling up in the tens of thousands, the position on the no-fly zone will change. Why not do it now and save those tens of thousands of lives? If we really, really want to protect those people, the no-fly zone, even if it's limited to Kiev and the corridors of safety, surely it's time to start that now.
Look, I understand the argument, and there's head and heart in all of this, but the reality is we don't think, and our allies don't think, we ought to be sucked into a direct military conflict with Vladimir Putin. And that's the position that we've taken. Of course, it would be different if he was attacking a NATO ally. The position around NATO is very clear, but we will do everything short of that to support the Ukrainians, and I understand the debate around it.
Well, you say everything short of that, but you know how that will be heard in Ukraine. We are prepared to do anything up to the point where it will make a difference.
Well, no, I don't think that's true. First of all, I think the efficacy of no-fly zones, if you look at history, you can think of the Iraq example, they're very difficult, they're very challenging. Secondly, if you look at the impact of our sanctions, and the UK has been at the vanguard of the international response, I think the fact that Putin and the Russian central bank have doubled interest rates to 20%, we think of what the cost of living challenges we're facing here, I do think that not only puts a squeeze on the Putin war machine, but also it shows the ordinary Russian people that this idea that this is in their interest is for the birds. So at every level, I think the sanctions will have an impact, but they won't do so overnight.
Indeed, that's the point.
That's the bit I accept.
That is the point. The problem is, for the people of Ukraine, overnight is what matters. Now is what matters. And this geopolitics of it and so on, frankly, they may appreciate, but it doesn't save them. And let's just deal with the point you made, by the way, 200,000 people you think may come to the United Kingdom. Now, last week, your colleague Liz Truss said to me that at the same time on Sunday, UK couldn't commit to admitting any Ukrainians with family here. By that evening, Priti Patel had eased the rules a bit, and that was widely criticised. And Friday night, you fell into line with the rest of the EU and agreed to admit people with family here. The point I'm making is, why not just take the next step now, rather than having to be dragged over days to get to do the right thing?
I mean, in fairness, Trevor, I think if you look the Hong Kong British National Overseas Citizens, if you look at Operation Pitting and what we did for those Afghans fleeing and our history as a country, I think we've always stepped up, and we have here. But you're right to say that we looked and adjusted the family dependence
It wasn't an
criteria.
adjust. That was a 180-degree turn. Your colleague sat there and said, no, we can't do that. By Friday night, you were doing it.
And absolutely, we responded very swiftly. And I think that's the right thing to do, and for all the reasons that you've given. And I've always felt that we should be open-hearted. By the way, on that, if we started abrogating security checks on those coming from a war zone, I think, first of all, it would be the wrong thing to do. We've got to look at our security. Secondly, I think you'd see public support, which has been incredible, very moving and overwhelming. I think you would start to see that fray. In the same way as, let's be honest, if we were engaged in a military direct conflict with Vladimir Putin, I think the consensus about what we're doing would also fray. So just to be clear about this, you've got to think these things through, and we've got to be measured as well as resolute.
All right, look, but isn't the point here that what seems to happen is not so much that you're reacting to events, but you're being dragged to events, and that actually what you're really doing is following rather than leading on sanctions, on the refugees? You've issued stirring press releases, then changed the position. Don't you? Is it that what we're seeing here, a government which doesn't want to take the political risks that are actually involved in truly confronting Putin?
Well, I just don't think that's true on the facts, if I may say so, Trevor. Let me give you the example of sanctions. We were out ahead. And if you take Russian banks, we have sanctioned more Russian banks in the EU, including Sberbank, the biggest Russian bank. If you take Russian companies, 3 million are subject to restrictions, which means they can't raise finance or be listed in the UK. That was well ahead of anything the EU has done. It's true that the sanctions approach of the US and the EU and the UK, they're not identical, but I'm afraid I do not accept your proposition. We've been at the vanguard. And actually, if you talk to ordinary Ukrainians, or indeed the Ukrainian ambassador, he has paid tribute, and they pay tribute to the resolve and the solidarity we've shown.
All right, let's take a very practical example. 3 weeks ago, Liz Truss told me that Putin's friends and associates, these are her words, would have no place to hide. Take a look at a picture I'm going to show you. This is a gentleman called General Sergei Shoigu. He is the Russian defense minister. He should turn up here. Here he is. There is Mr. Putin's closest associate he's running the campaign. He met our own defence minister 3 weeks ago on February 23rd, day before the invasion, sanctioned by the EU. 2 days later, sanctioned by the USA. 11 days after the Russians invaded, he is still not sanctioned by us. Why not?
Look, I'm always very careful not to talk about individuals because in relation to criminal prosecutions or sanctions, but let me answer the question. Let me answer the question squarely. But it's not right, actually, for me to prejudge or any legal action we take. It's very serious. It needs to be done on the evidence and on the legal
11
criteria.
days.
Yeah, but these things, you need to have evidence that he has got assets here.
So the EU and the USA are basically breaching proper legal.
Well, I don't know in relation
sanctions?
to the facts, but first of all, you've got to have evidence of the legal criteria. He's also got to have assets, if you're talking about immediate action against assets, in the UK. So we do have the rule of law in this country. We do these things carefully. But and as a result of that, by the way, we have far more impact. When I introduced the Sergei Magnitsky sanctions for human rights abuses, but also for corruption, based on the biggest tax fraud in Russian history, we had all of these arguments about whether we moved more quickly, which we did in many cases also. But the reality is we avoided successful legal challenge against those sanctions. Nothing would be a greater PR coup for Putin than if we put sanctions on someone and then we found they were successfully appealed. So we do act swiftly, and that is important. We also need to make sure we can do so sustainably, because that's where the credibility comes from.
Will you then stop your colleague, the Prime Minister, going about saying that we've sanctioned 100 people?
Well, it's over 100 entities, and I think if you take since 2014, 250 individuals have been sanctioned.
But this person who has been sanctioned by pretty much everybody else isn't sanctioned by us.
You'll always be able to do this, Trevor. You'll be able to point to one or other. If you take the picture overall and look not just at individuals, but the corporate vehicles that they have assets through, banks, companies, as well as the individuals, we yield to no one in our record. They're not just moving swiftly, but also robustly. And again, those figures on banks and companies, 3 million Russian companies, and often you find the associates or the individuals are operating through those businesses or banks, cannot now list on the UK stock market, cannot now raise money loans in the UK.
All right, well, let's talk about how far we're prepared to go. The war's already caused a huge spike in energy costs. When you're going to tell the British people that they are going to have to pay a price here, and by the way, might it not be the moment for you to think again about that national insurance tax rise of 1.25%, given the pain that we're going to have to face?
Well, look, first of all, in terms of the funding of social care, I think we should be dealing with the social care problem. It's been ducked by successive governments. I'm proud that this government is going to deal with the social care challenge that so many people face. On energy prices, we've been very clear. If you have a global crisis, a conflict involving Russia or any other oil or gas producer, it's going to have an impact on global prices. In fact, we get just 4% of our gas from Russia, so we are much less reliant than others. But what we're going to do in terms of supply is keep expanding the renewables. We're going to invest more in nuclear, particularly those small nuclear reactors, and we're also going to make sure we can rely for resilience on the North Sea production.
But the price of energy is going to go up. We know that.
So let me tell you,
and
what
the only way you're going to be able to protect people is by expanding supply. So, are you going to tell people that they're going to have to pay 1,000 and plus more? Or, by the way, are you going to think about returning to coal or fracking?
No, we're not
going to do something.
We're not going to return to coal. But I've given you the three areas: North Sea oil production, where we'll have more resilience, renewables, and nuclear, where we do need to increase supply, and that is already part of our strategy. In terms of protecting consumers, I mean, just to be clear, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have put £20 billion into the cost of living challenge that we face right now to protect consumers. 9 billion of that is to support with energy bills. So from the winter fuel payments through to the discounts and the rebates on council tax and energy bills, we're already providing this support to make sure we can see ourselves through what we hope will be a temporary crisis.
All right. Let's talk very briefly now about the potential endgame. Mr. Putin has said overnight that sanctions are an act of war. Do you fear that a cornered, isolated Kremlin, with its troops bogged down in a conflict that Mr. Putin didn't anticipate, could actually reach for the nuclear button?
No, I think the debate and the rhetoric around that is just that. But what it does show you, I mean, first of all, just to be clear, sanctions are not an act of war. International law was very clear about that. Our sanctions are entirely both legally justified but also proportionate to what we're trying to deal with. But what it does show you is that this has not been the cakewalk Putin expected. And it's not just us hearing that message, it's Russian people and those Russian conscripts who were told they were peacekeepers in Ukraine, who are finding fearsome resistance from the Ukrainians. But this was not what their commander-in-chief had promised them.
But I should say to you that he has said, I think it's come out this morning by the Russian news agency, that the Ukraine is developing a dirty nuclear bomb. No evidence for that whatsoever.
None.
But could that be preparation on his part for an escalation to the use of what I think ludicrously, but anyway, are called battlefield nuclear weapons?
I think it's rhetoric and brinkmanship, and Putin's at various times, I mean, he's got a track record as long as anyone's arm of misinformation and propaganda. We saw that through the pandemic. And this is a distraction from what the real issues are at hand, which is that it's an illegal invasion and it is not going according to plan. You're absolutely right, though, Trevor, to say that makes him even more unpredictable. And that's why working in the UN, working with our NATO allies, working with our international partners around the world, I mean, China has got a job here. They've got to step up as well. This is a permanent member of the Security Council. India as well. So we need to expand the diplomatic pressure, but let's not get distracted by the propaganda of Putin.
Deputy Prime Minister, thank you so much.